"Can I sleep in your garage tonight?" James was startled. His keys clattered onto the stone floor. He looked toward the garage door. A little girl was huddled in the rain. She looked to be about 7 years old, soaked to the bone. Her hair was plastered to her grimy face, and she clutched an old wooden box. She repeated, her voice a tiny whisper, "I promise I'll leave as soon as it's light out." James didn't answer right away. He just stood there, staring into the little girl's eyes. It wasn't pity. It was a heart-wrenchingly familiar feeling. In that instant, he was no longer a successful 4 or 5-year-old man, but an 8-year-old boy again, standing on a porch, watching his father's car disappear into the rain, leaving him behind with an endless loneliness. It was the same look, the eyes of an abandoned child, terrified and lost. The icy wall he had built around his heart for so many years seemed to crack. A strange, faint warmth crept into his chest. For the first time in years, he felt his heart truly stir. Forget the logical reasons. Forget the inconvenience. He just knew he couldn't leave this child out in the rain. "Come inside," he said, his voice hoarse, almost a rough command. The little girl hesitated, her eyes wide with caution. This sudden kindness was more frightening than the cold rain. She looked at his stern face, then at the warm, yellow light spilling from inside the house. After a long moment, she gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. She stepped over the threshold, timidly and slowly, like a small animal entering an unknown world. She left tiny, muddy footprints on the polished marble floor. He should have been annoyed. His house was always clean and orderly. But he wasn't. James just stared silently at the footprints. For the first time in a decade, the massive mansion no longer felt empty. Those dirty footprints, in a strange way, brought life into the house, and it felt a little less cold. James remained still, his eyes fixed on the muddy tracks across the gleaming floor. They weren't stains. They were proof that life had just walked in. Then he heard the soft chattering of teeth. He looked up. The girl was still standing by the door, hugging her shoulders, shivering uncontrollably, not from fear, but from cold. Her thin clothes were drenched. "You'll catch a cold," James blurted out, his tone harsher than he'd intended. "Come, follow me." This time, he didn't wait for her to hesitate. He led the way into the living room. When he switched on the crystal chandeliers, a vast space was illuminated. Emily held her breath. The room was bigger than any place she had ever been. The ceiling soared. The sofas looked as large as small beds, and the rug was so thick she felt her feet would sink into it. She stood frozen at the edge of the carpet, afraid to take another step. James noticed her reluctance. He looked down at her soaked clothes, then at her face, pale with cold. "Wait here," he said, his voice a little softer now. He hurried upstairs. A few minutes later, he returned with a white cotton t-shirt and a soft, thick bath towel. It was the smallest shirt he could find, but on Emily's tiny frame, it still looked like a giant nightgown. He said nothing, only gesturing for her to follow him to another door down the hall. "Go take a shower. The hot water is on this side," he said, pointing to the gleaming faucet in the enormous bathroom, which featured a pristine white porcelain tub. He placed the shirt and towel on a nearby stool. "Use these." With that, he gently closed the door, leaving her in privacy. Standing alone in the hallway, listening to the faint sound of running water, James leaned against the wall and let out a long breath. He had no idea what he was doing, but for the first time in a very long time, he felt like he was doing something that truly mattered. A short while later, the bathroom door creaked open. Emily emerged, looking small and lost in James's oversized white t-shirt, which hung almost to her knees. Her damp hair was hastily toweled, clinging to a freshly washed face that revealed pale skin and large, clear eyes. Unsure of what to say, James turned toward the kitchen. "You must be hungry." His kitchen was modern and sterile, with gleaming stainless steel surfaces that looked as if they were rarely used for actual cooking. He rummaged through the refrigerator, finally finding a can of tomato soup and a loaf of bread. He wasn't much of a cook, but this was the simplest thing he could manage. The click of the gas stove and the clatter of silverware echoed in the silent house. Soon, a warm aroma filled the kitchen. He placed a steaming bowl of soup and a few slices of crispy toast on the table in front of the quiet little girl. Emily looked at the soup, then back up at him, as if in disbelief. With trembling hands, she picked up the spoon, dipped it into the bowl, and brought it to her lips. The moment the warm soup touched her tongue, something inside her broke. Tears began to stream down her cheeks, splashing into the bowl. But she didn't stop eating. She wept as she ate, hastily, as if afraid the meal would vanish. To Emily, this wasn't just tomato soup. It was the best meal she'd had after days of wandering and hunger. When James wasn't looking, she quickly hid a slice of toast in the old wooden box she kept by her side, a habit born of scarcity, of always having to save something for an uncertain tomorrow. After she finished, sleepiness made Emily's eyelids heavy. James realized he hadn't even thought about where she would sleep. The guest rooms were too large and cold. Suddenly, he thought of a place. He led Emily to the library. It was his favorite room, a cozy sanctuary with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lining the walls. The smell of old paper and wood created a peaceful atmosphere. He took the thickest, softest blankets and made a comfortable bed on the long leather sofa. Emily stood in the middle of the room, her eyes wide as she gazed at the endless rows of books around her. She looked so small in that vast world of knowledge. Once tucked into the blankets, she turned to James and whispered in amazement, "I've never slept in a room with so many books before." With that, she closed her eyes and quickly fell asleep. James stood there for a long time. Emily's simple words echoed in his mind. To him, these books were a given, but to her, they were an unimaginable wonder. That night, James tossed and turned, thinking about the world she must have come from, and about the emptiness in his own world that he had never truly recognized until tonight. The next morning, James woke up in an armchair in his study with a stiff neck. He hadn't gone to his own bed, choosing instead to watch over the strange little girl sleeping soundly in his library. Morning sunlight streamed through the windows, casting golden stripes across the thousands of books and illuminating Emily's peaceful face. When she woke, the first thing she did was touch the wooden box beside her, as if to make sure it was still there. Seeing James, she flinched slightly, but lacked the terrified look from the night before. After a simple breakfast of cereal and milk, which James had to search for in his little used pantry, he looked at Emily's dirty, wrinkled clothes, which had been washed and dried overnight. They were thin and worn. "We need to get you some clothes," James declared, his tone like he was solving a business problem. He took Emily to a luxury shopping mall, where everything was shiny and expensive. Emily was overwhelmed. She stayed close to James's side, her small hand clutching the hem of his coat as they walked past displays of dazzling dresses and eye-catching toys. In a large toy store, James pointed to a row of perfect princess dolls in their boxes. "Which one do you like?" Emily just shook her head shyly. The dolls, with their vacant smiles and glittering gowns, seemed to belong to another world, a world she wasn't a part of. They were too new, too perfect. On their way out, as they passed a small thrift shop tucked away in a corner, Emily suddenly stopped. She pointed at something in the window display. It was an old leather satchel, its brown color faded, its strap showing a few cracks, and its brass buckle tarnished with age. "Can we go look?" she whispered. James frowned. Why this when he could buy her anything new, anything better? But seeing the eager look in Emily's eyes, he nodded. Inside, Emily went straight to the satchel, hugging it reverently. To her, it wasn't old. It held a promise, a hope of going to school, of learning to read, of being like other normal children. Watching her, James felt a pang of confusion and sorrow. He knelt beside her, his voice gentler than it had ever been. "You don't need old things anymore, Emily," he said, using her name for the first time. "You deserve better." Emily looked up at him, her eyes clear. "It's not old," she said firmly. "It's just waiting for books." Her simple reply left James stunned. He suddenly realized that what she needed wasn't expensive toys. What she craved was a future, a sense of normalcy. In her eyes, that old satchel was the key to that future. He said nothing more, quietly paying for the bag. That day, they left the shopping center with James carrying bags of brand new clothes in one hand, while Emily clutched the old leather satchel in hers, as if it were the most precious treasure in the world. A few weeks passed. James's house was no longer silent. Now, there was the occasional sound of Emily's giggles from the library or the pitter-patter of her feet running down the hall. James found he had grown accustomed to those sounds. He had grown accustomed to having someone to care for. That peace was shattered on a sunny Saturday afternoon. James took Emily for a walk in a park near the Hudson River. She was wearing a new dress, holding an ice cream cone, and happily pointing out the swans swimming on the water. James found himself smiling, a genuine smile, perhaps for the first time in years. He felt a strange joy, a sense of completeness as he watched her happiness. But then, Emily's smile vanished. The ice cream cone fell from her hand. Her body went rigid, her eyes wide and fixed on an old park bench under a tree. James followed her gaze. Sitting there was a thin, haggard woman in shabby clothes. Her messy hair hid most of her face, but her eyes were unmistakable. They were tired and empty until they landed on Emily. Instantly, they lit up with a sick sort of brightness. "Mom," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. Her whole body began to tremble. James reacted instantly. He took a step forward, instinctively shielding Emily behind him. The woman staggered to her feet and rushed toward them. "Emily! Sweetheart! It's me!" she cried, her voice hoarse and pleading. Emily clung fearfully to James's leg, her hand gripping his coat. "Please," the woman begged, nearly falling to her knees before James, tears streaming down her face. "Let me talk to her, just for a minute. She's my daughter. Please." James looked down at the broken woman, then felt the trembling of the little girl behind him. He felt a mix of anger and pity. He could see the clear marks of addiction that had ravaged her. "You're scaring her," James said, his voice low and firm. No, I'm sorry, baby," the woman tried to call out over James's shoulder. "I miss you. We'll be a family again, I promise." But Emily only sobbed, burying her face in James's back. James couldn't stand it any longer. He bent down and swept Emily into his arms. She immediately wrapped her arms around his neck, holding on like he was a lifeline. "Stay away from her," James said definitively to the woman, his eyes like ice. He turned and walked away quickly, leaving the sounds of desperate sobs and pleas behind him. As they moved away, Emily didn't dare let go, her small face hidden in his shoulder. That encounter shattered the wall of silence around Emily's past, and it brought troubles James could never have anticipated. Just 2 days later, a professional-looking woman appeared at his mansion door. She introduced herself as Sarah Johnson, a social worker. Someone had filed a report about a homeless child living with a single man. Sarah was polite but firm. She toured the house, spoke gently with Emily, and then had a private conversation with James. "Mr. Anderson, I can see you care deeply for the child," Sarah said in a neutral tone. "But the law prioritizes family reunification, provided the mother can prove she's fit to provide care. I'd advise you to think carefully about your role in this." The advice felt like a cold warning. The trouble didn't stop there. Catherine, James's sister, showed up that very evening after hearing rumors. She stormed into the house, her sharp eyes landing on the frightened child hiding behind her brother. "What in the world are you doing, James?" Catherine hissed once they were in private. "What if the press gets wind of this? A single tycoon with a homeless child of unknown origin? They'll tear our family's reputation to shreds." James felt cornered, pressured by both the law and his family. But when he looked at Emily, all those warnings faded away. He just knew he couldn't lose her. But the one in the most turmoil was Emily. Her mother's promise, however hollow, had planted a toxic seed of hope in her heart. To be a family again. The word family was what she craved more than anything. And her mother exploited that. She found ways to sneak to the back garden fence, whispering promises of a new life, just the two of them, without any strangers. One afternoon, while James was busy with calls from his lawyers, he realized the house was eerily quiet. He called Emily's name, but there was no answer. A dreadful feeling washed over him as he ran to her room. It was empty. And what made his heart stop was that the old wooden box was gone too. He understood immediately. Emily had left willingly. James bolted from the house, his heart pounding in his chest. He drove frantically through the streets, his mind racing, trying to guess where they could have gone. Then an idea struck him: the Brooklyn Bridge. It was a place he and Emily often walked, where she loved to watch the boats on the river. A public place, crowded, easy to get lost in. As his car screeched to a halt at the base of the bridge, he saw them. The mother was gripping Emily's hand, practically dragging her through the throng of pedestrians. Emily kept looking back over her shoulder, her face streaked with tears of regret and fear. Just then, dodging a cyclist, the mother abruptly pulled Emily backward straight into the road. A city bus was hurtling toward them. The shriek of tires and the screams of pedestrians filled the air. Time seemed to stop. James didn't think. He just acted. He threw the car door open, launching himself out like an arrow. In the split second before the bus was upon Emily, James reached him. He threw his arms around both mother and child with all his strength, pulling them back onto the sidewalk in a desperate lunge. The bus roared past, the wind from it whipping their faces. For a second, everything was silent before Emily's cries broke the spell. James lay sprawled on the cold pavement, his arms still wrapped tightly around Emily, shielding her from the impact. The sounds of horns and screams around him faded. All he could hear was his own ragged breathing and the violent drumming of his heart. Emily's mother lay crumpled beside them, her face white with terror. But Emily scrambled out of her mother's grasp. She turned and threw herself into James's arms, her small hands clinging to his neck. She sobbed, her hot tears soaking his shirt. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry," she choked out. Then, through her tears, she looked up, her tear-stained face meeting his gaze. A heartbreaking courage and clarity shone in her eyes. "I wanted to believe her," Emily admitted, her voice broken but clear, "but I knew you were the only one who would really protect me." Those words, spoken by a child who had just escaped death, were more powerful than any contract or promise. It was a choice, an act of absolute trust. James held Emily tight. He felt not just her small, trembling body, but a profound, powerful bond being forged in that life or death moment. And then he understood. All this time, he thought he was saving a child, but he was wrong. It was Emily who, with her existence, with her trust, had saved him. She had pulled him from the empty, meaningless, and cold life in which he had imprisoned himself. He hadn't just saved a life. He had found his own soul again. 6 weeks later, silence had permanently departed from the Anderson mansion. Now, the vast space was filled not with coldness, but with the sounds of life, the clumsy notes of a piano from the living room, the rustle of pages turning in the library, and the sound of Emily's giggles as she told James about her first day of school. The old leather satchel was now stuffed with books and crayon drawings. Emily was healthy, happy, and for the first time in her life, she had a place to truly call home. The legal battle finally came to an end. In court, after hearing the testimony from Sarah Johnson and witnessing the undeniable bond between the two, the judge officially granted James full custody of Emily. Her biological mother, with the help of social services, was admitted into a rehabilitation center to begin her own long journey. As the judge's gavel fell, ending the hearing, Emily turned to the man who had saved her. She didn't say Mr. Anderson. Instead, another word, simple and sacred, escaped her lips. "Dad." James froze. The world seemed to stop. He, a man who had only ever known numbers and business deals, felt a single, warm tear roll down his cheek for the first time. The contract just signed by his heart was worth more than any fortune he had ever amassed. Beside him, Catherine said nothing, but quietly placed a hand on her brother's shoulder. It was a gesture of acceptance, of support. A family had truly been mended. Not long after, Emily's Haven was born. James used his fortune and influence to establish a charitable foundation dedicated to helping abandoned and abused children, offering them a safe refuge and a chance to start over. He didn't just give Emily a home. He turned her story into a beacon of hope for thousands of other children. On a sunny afternoon, Emily led James back to the Brooklyn Bridge. They stood together on the very spot where life and death had nearly collided. But this time, there was no fear, only peace. From her satchel, Emily took out a small wooden plaque she had decorated herself. With a red ribbon, she carefully tied it to the railing. On it, written in a child's careful hand, were the words, "For those who are afraid of losing their home, and for those who found one." The story ends at sunset, as the soft, golden light stretches across the Hudson River. James and Emily, hand in hand, walk along the riverbank. Behind them, their old mansion was no longer a cold piece of architecture, but a true home, where love had healed two lonely souls and created a legacy that would last forever.